Tabletop RPGs have thrived for decades because they offer a variety of different types of enjoyment. The best RPG doesn't exist. The actual value of each game hinges entirely on the specific kinds of joy you happen to seek around the table. In this video, I want to discuss 7 distinct types of enjoyment that TTRPGs can bring. In the course of doing so, I will be naming some example games that tend to focus on each of these joys, but note that while some of these games definitely seem focused on one particular joy or another, any given RPG can deliver several of these types of enjoyment. And then if you consider the infinite variety of GM and playstyles at individual tables, the example games that I provide are even more nebulously categorized. But the joys themselves, they seem pretty solidly defined, at least to me. Ultimately, the reason I wanted to discuss all of these is to try and shed some light on the subjectivity of RPG opinions expressed online. I see posts and comments every day where people declare that a game is horrible for one reason or another, and in most cases, they're just misunderstanding the fact that they subscribe to certain kinds of joy from RPGs, and not other kinds of joy. The fact is, not all RPGs can serve all people. In a perfect world, these commenters would understand where their personal preferences start and end, and then, armed with that self-knowledge, maybe reconsider disparaging an RPG in a nasty comment on the internet. The puzzle solvers. Unlike video games where solutions to player problems have to be pre-programmed, often to a rigid degree, tabletop RPGs thrust the player into problems that can contain dozens of viable solutions. I say dozens and not infinite because any given RPG does have rules that define the boundaries of what player characters can do, and GMs only have so much patience. But that thrill of being faced with a problem for which there are tons of different solutions, that's where the magic happens for a lot of people who play RPGs. Your choices, both brilliant and potentially disastrous, shape the solution. But there's no single correct solution, just one woven from your creativity, the rules of the game, and usually a roll of the dice, but sometimes just the fiat of the GM. The pursuit of this kind of joy is particularly prominent in the OSR movement. OSR games often have simpler character sheets and mechanics, placing more emphasis on the player's ability to think outside the box and improvise solutions. I once saw an OSR t-shirt that perfectly captures the spirit. It said something like, "The solution is not on your character sheet." Well, the solution can and often is on your character sheet in an RPG, but not if you're playing in the spirit of the particular subgenre of OSR games, where you're supposed to come up with novel solutions outside of, or maybe just tangentially related to your character's abilities. And as far as examples of OSR games, there are too many good ones to count at this point, even though they all started off based on the oldest versions of Dungeons & Dragons, or even directly copied from it, such as in the case of Old School Essentials. There are now simpler and more directly pleasurable OSR games, such as Knave, Shadow Dark, and Mothership, and ones set in strangely imagined worlds, such as Into the Odd, Electric Bastionland, and Dolmenwood. In each of these games, you're expected to put together a character with gear and abilities and all that, but when it comes to facing problems, you're going to want to put your thinking cap on, the story weavers. All RPGs tend to produce a story of one kind or another, and there are definitely some games where the emerging story is disjointed or kind of flat and no one seems to care because they're not there for that. But there is a whole domain of RPGs that focuses on creating story. Games that aim to do this arm their players with a lot of power and narrative agency, giving them the role of co-author alongside the GM in a collaborative story. The GM sets the stage, crafting a world with possibilities, but it's player choices that truly define the narrative. The seminal shift in RPGs that practically formalized story gaming is Apocalypse World by Meg and Vincent Baker, which established a rules paradigm where players can narrate their characters doing just about anything, and only certain actions will trigger a rule called a move, which may include a dice roll. This game led to an explosion of spin-offs, including a more complex but structured paradigm starting in Blades in the Dark by John Harper. The mantra these game creators tend to invoke is fiction first, which means anytime there's a point in the game where a rule conflicts with the story making sense or taking a cool turn, you ignore the rule for the sake of the story. The games based on Apocalypse World and Blades in the Dark, sometimes referred to as Powered by the Apocalypse and Forged in the Dark, respectively, have occasionally become the best-selling or highest-profile RPGs in recent years, second only to the corporate-backed traditional RPG Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and increasingly OSR games. I think the reason story games are attractive to so many is because for a lot of people, telling the story is the point. They don't want to fiddle with crunch and rules minutia, or puzzle solving for that matter. They want to tell a cool story. The wanderlusters. For some, the beauty of RPGs lies not just in the stories being told, but in the worlds you explore. Again, comparing tabletop RPGs to video games, with video games, most of the time the world is pretty small, relatively. Even in world exploration games, where one of the main intended thrills is in walking or flying around and discovering new things, the world is actually still pretty limited geographically to a few square kilometers and an invisible list of pre-programmed interactive events. And even with procedurally generated galaxies, the illusion is quickly broken because there's not really that much variety in the end. But with tabletop RPGs that emphasize discovery, there are only two limitations to an infinity of possibilities in a world. The published setting details, if you're even playing in a published setting and not a homebrew, and the imagination of the GM. In terms of hours of play required to truly discover everything in a tabletop RPG world, it could be years or even decades. Well-crafted and coherent settings, such as Glorantha in RuneQuest or Imperial Rome in Lex Arcana, are described across thousands of pages. Within this particular joy of exploration and discovery, I'd want to include a sub-variety of exploration that comes with licensed intellectual property. Some GMs and players find a lot of joy in stepping in not just published settings, but ones which have already been represented in other media to some degree. At this point, there are tens of thousands of RPGs that have done this since it's been happening for about half a century. The ones I've reviewed on this channel include the Alien RPG, the One Ring 2nd Edition, The Walking Dead, and Blade Runner, all by Free League, Dune Adventures in the Imperium, and Star Trek Adventures by Modiphius, and Transformers and G.I. Joe by Renegade Studios. All those games lean on fanship and knowledge of pre-existing media to lend a sense of familiarity, but with that comes the reward of creating the illusion that you've stepped into a world from a movie, TV show, or comic book that you love, and have been given the power to interact with it. Genre heads. One of the biggest engines of growth in the hobby is the increased output of genre-specific games, and that's because people are often yearning to experience a particular type of story. Now more than ever, people who decide that they like a particular genre have multiple games to choose from, and they get to explore that genre from different angles, with different levels of mechanical complexity and approach to narrative. For example, horror investigation is a genre, and Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu has long served that need, but the genre itself has grown to encompass many different flavors, like Monster of the Week, where you play as monster hunters but in a campier, more action-oriented context, or Vassin and Candela Obscura, which both place you in a specific organization which investigates the supernatural in a fantasy 19th century setting. This might be a miscategorization, but I'd almost think of solo journaling games as a particular genre, one that has grown quite a bit over the years. 1,000-Year-Old Vampire by Tim Hutchins made a big splash by offering solo players the ability to follow a series of writing prompts and end up telling the life story of an immortal bloodsucker of the player's design who eventually dies. Ironsworn and Starforged, both by Sean Tompkin, can be played as co-op or GM-run RPGs, but are renowned for their solo playability, where again there is a journaling element that a lot of people find extremely enjoyable. There are countless subgenres, and if you can find the one that tickles you the most, you're in luck, because at this point there are probably now at least 3 RPGs for it. The Art of War. For some tables, the truest joy of TTRPGs lies in the thrill of tactical combat. This particular thrill is actually at the genesis of the hobby in the 1970s, given D&D's beginnings as an offshoot of a tabletop war game. A lot of people entering the hobby for the first time now actually mistake the entire hobby as being focused on tactical combat, since the ubiquitous 5e tends to have so many rules pertaining to combat encounters. But for the people who do truly enjoy meticulously building out their character's specs and abilities, then pitting them against enemies on a grid over and over, 5e is kinda decent, and games like Pathfinder and Lancer are even better since they are even more focused on the nuances of combat tactics. Virtual tabletops like Roll20 and Foundry shine particularly bright with these kinds of RPGs because they take on a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to small calculations and rules housekeeping. But in the most hardcore instances of tactical RPG play, character development in the narrative sense, rather than in the mechanical sense, as well as storytelling, can be all but forgotten. Hero crafters. For those who actually care about their characters' lives, their greatest joy in RPGs lies in the journey of PC development. The biggest thrill for them is in the satisfaction of crafting a character, then watching them slowly grow and evolve, amassing abilities, increasing stats, improving their gear, and in some cases even gaining influence and power over a domain. The beauty lies in the appreciable incremental growth, a phenomenon we don't always get to enjoy in real life, where endless toil doesn't automatically yield a whole new magic spell or a whole point in wisdom or upgraded technology. Video game RPGs happen to be exceptionally good at feeding this joy as well. In both video game and tabletop RPGs, each successful battle and each challenge that's overcome contributes to your character's development, but I'd go as far as to say that video game RPGs tend to do it a little better with addictive skill trees and visceral, highly visual gear upgrades. But that being said, the stories told in video game RPGs are not your stories. You never get to craft the character's background or narrate their inner and external dialogue in a video game. It's always just the mechanical growth of a character. In tabletop RPGs, the journey of character growth can and often does extend beyond mechanics, at least with a clever and attentive GM. The consequences of your choices can shape your character's future and the immediate world around them. And even the mechanical rules for character advancement are often deeper and more thought-provoking than in video games. A number of tabletop RPGs offer particularly deep character advancement mechanics that enhance this experience. Burning Wheel utilizes a unique belief system, allowing you to define your character's core values and witness how actions reinforce or contradict those beliefs. Traveler has you fleshing out your character's life story before their adventure career even begins. The classic Powered by the Apocalypse games Masks: A New Generation and Monster Hearts both delve into the emotional complexities of adolescence, using character advancement to explore themes of identity, belonging, and the challenges of growing up, weaving mechanics into interactive psychodrama that's virtually impossible in a video game. And some games go even further, like Wanderhome, which all but drops the idea of a firm mechanical infrastructure to focus on a journey of emotions and introspection. The humanists. Sometimes the greatest joys found in RPGs are the human connections forged around the gaming table. The shared laughter, the collective groans of despair, the thrill of victory. Those are the things that a lot of people remember years after a session. I'm not necessarily talking about making friends. I just mean the brief human joy that can be experienced when having the same emotion or reaction as others in a small group. A meeting of the minds in the pursuit of all these other joys that I've talked about. Which is to say, those other joys are things that can be experienced, but to experience them together simultaneously with other people is a joy unto itself. While just about all multiplayer TTRPGs can foster social interaction, some of them lean more heavily into this aspect. Lighter rules encourage improvisation and role-playing, leaving more room for players to connect with each other. Consider games like Fiasco and Fate. The rules are simple, encouraging players to embrace the absurd and unpredictable. Or rules-light hack-and-slash games like Mork Borg, which on its surface might seem like an OSR game where you are expected to cleverly solve dungeon problems until you die a horrible death. And it is that, but the game was written with the express intention of playing with the goal of making jokes and trying to have a laugh. So those are 7 major kinds of joy that people can derive from RPGs. Any given game and group is going to encompass at least 2 or 3 of these joys, and they aren't exclusive. I may have missed some major ones. Maybe you can help me out in the comments by pointing out some other primary types of joy, or subcategories of joy that might fit under one of my 7. I'd also love to know which types of enjoyment you derive most from tabletop RPGs, and which games have served you best. I've left links down below for all the games I've mentioned. Thanks as always for watching. See ya!